Chapter 17. Irwin was as drop-dead as Windy remembered. Bright, casually sexy, and possessing a mouth that she probably shouldn't kiss her mother with. He liked that in a woman. Femme types could be such a drag, and though they'd only flirted around back in training, he was hopeful for what the evening might bring. They sat in control, sharing a flask of inexpensive blended synth and catching up. The door to the main observation deck was standing open, the soft night sounds of the jungle floating in on a balmy breeze, and they were alone, except for Evans. Technically, Windy was still on duty until midnight, but there weren't going to be any calls coming in. The most excitement they'd had in months was already parked outside, and Evans was catching a nap in the corner, drooling on his own arm. If Windy got tipped and anything important happened, he'd just wake him up. Evans owed him anyway. "So I'm screaming emergency, the intake spike is hitching, and my VTOL is out, right?" Irwin said. "And the dumb bitch tells me she can't clear me until I send my compressor reads." Windy laughed, keeping his voice low. He didn't want to wake Evans up. "What did you say?" Irwin grinned. "I told her, I'm about to drop 6 gross of barrel fuel oil all over your goddamn strip. And if she wanted my reads, she could read them off her own ass after I branded them there." "And what did she say?" "She told me I was cleared to land, not even in a blink." Irwin sipped from the flask, handing it back to Windy. "I made it down, obviously, but I found out later she walked the same day. Said she couldn't take the pressure." Windy laughed again, shaking his head. "She should have taken this job. In the last 8 months, I've landed 4 ships, including that shuttle and you. Most of my working time is spent listening to air and playing cards with Evans or Tom Cabot." Irwin raised her arms over her head and stretched as he spoke, a movement that did wonders for his point of view. She caught his appraising look and deliberately shook her chest from side to side, grinning wildly. "Enjoy it, Windy. It's as close as you're going to get," she said sweetly. "Probably." "Probably?" he asked. "Any chance of upgrading?" Irwin shrugged, reaching for the whiskey. "We'll see. So, no interesting stories, huh? No wild animal attacks out here? No secret jungle cults? Station fever?" Windy sighed. "No. Hey, a couple of our survey guys went missing today. Does that count?" Irwin shook her head. "Probably not. Although that reminds me. I saw something when I was coming in. Couple of clicks that way?" She pointed vaguely south. "Flash of light, real brief." Windy frowned. "Huh. Maybe that's them. We don't have any perimeter set up, so it had to be." Ka-chink. From just outside, like something metal being dropped onto the deck. "What's that?" Irwin asked nervously. Windy didn't know. "Something fell off one of the landing decks, maybe?" There was a shuffling sound, like leaves brushing one of the smaller stabilizing envelopes, and then a soft clattering sound, like a bone rattle being shook underwater. They both stood up, looking towards the open door, Windy suddenly feeling stone sober in spite of how much drink he'd had. 8 months of quiet Bunda nights, learning every natural sound that the planet had to offer, and he'd never heard anything like that. "Something hanging off the platform? Scraping the trees or something?" Irwin asked. Windy shook his head. It was a calm night, and the nav computers automatically adjusted for flux when the wind was blowing. He knew he should take charge, walk out and look around and tell Irwin that it was nothing. But he didn't want to go outside. In fact, he felt quite strongly that it was a shitty idea. Don't be a wooze, not with her watching. He was being stupid, and he also knew the longer he waited, the less he'd feel like moving. It was 5 meters to the door, and he could see the deck past it, a piece of railing against a backdrop of darkness. Nothing. There was nothing there. "Wait here a sec, okay?" he said, finally having shamed himself into heading for the door. Irwin ignored him, following 1 step behind. He decided that he didn't mind. "Snap out of it. You're too old for this." Windy paused at the door, searching for movement, and saw nothing. He hadn't realised how tense he'd become until he relaxed. The perfectly normal, ordinary sight of nothing at all confirming how paranoid he was. He walked towards the railing, grinning at himself. "Nothing but me and thee and a shitload of trees," he said, and heard Irwin actually giggle behind him. Yeah, tonight was looking good. He couldn't remember having ever heard Kelly Irwin giggle. "Hey, what's this?" he said absently, moving towards the rail. There was a metal claw hanging off the top of the bar, like a grappling hook, a taut rope disappearing down into the leafy dark. Was someone actually trying to climb the station? Bullshit. It was possible. The ground was only 10 meters down. But who'd want to scale an ME when there was a lift? And even if one of the techs wanted to climb something, the area they picked was incredibly dangerous. If they happened to snag one of the stabilizers, they could do some serious damage. Suddenly, the air in front of his eyes shifted, blurring, and a bitter, oily scent flooded his nostrils. And there was a sound like metal again. And then a scream. A howling, feral shriek that was so close Windy could feel its stinking heat across his face. And then heat on his throat, wet and sharp and complete. And then he couldn't stand up anymore. The sudden scream was terrible, a bestial, animal cry that seemed to come from thin air. And then Windy fell backwards, and all Irwin could see was blood. A pumping, solid sheath of red that was dressing him, enveloping him from the neck down. Oh! It was all she could think, confused and shocked. He was just standing there, and now he's... There was a distortion in front of her, in the very air. Part of the railing seemed closer for just a second, as if it had been magnified, and Irwin heard a trilling sound coming from the distortion, a sound like a choking bird. And she'd seen and heard enough. She turned, sprinting back into the control room, screaming at the sleeping man in the corner, slamming her hand down on the panel of buttons that might close the door. "Sound the alarm! Man down! Man down! Something got him! Sound the fucking alarm!" Behind her, the door dropped shut, and at the same time the floor shifted violently underfoot, tilting at a 15-degree slant before swinging back down. The flask on the console hit the floor, the air filling with the sharp smell of liquor, and from outside, another scream. A clicking, rattling shriek of fury, not human and not alone. Another cry rising to join it, and a third. Irwin spun, desperately searching the thin air for that blurred strangeness, and saw nothing. The sleeper, Evans, was on his feet, stumbling for a control board and asking what had happened, what was happening. Irwin didn't know, and Windy was surely dead. Shivering, she stumbled to a cabinet in the control room's corner to try and find some kind of weapon. The convict was only half conscious, and Lara had started to insist that there was no download. The psych projections had suggested as much, and also that beating Jess down was the surest path to her eventual submission. Briggs let Keane continue, hoping that she'd give it up before the guard battered him to death. Briggs was a civilized man, and while violence was a valuable and often necessary tool, he didn't particularly enjoy watching it. Their young teammate only seemed half-conscious himself, staring at the exosuit, lips trembling, as Lara screamed for Keane to stop. It really was fairly brutal. Briggs was starting to think that he'd have to drag the whole lot to the nearest company lab for an expensive chemical flush when the station suddenly moved, violently. Briggs wheeled his arms, grabbing one of the handholds on the wall as the floor settled back down, but at a slight list. Nirasawa still had Lara and Ellis in hand, although Keane had joined Jess on the floor. Vincent was clutching the pilot seat, an expression of alarm replacing the queasy look he'd worn for the last 10 minutes. "Vincent, what's going on?" Briggs demanded, his heart fluttering from the unexpected jolt. Keane was on his feet again, looking to him for instruction, his knuckles red and swollen. Vincent shook his head, his eyes wide. I don't know. The whole platform like that, it has to be someone at the main controls." "Wonderful. Show me." Briggs said, monumentally irritated by the rude interruption, and a little uncomfortable with the naked fear on Vincent's mousy face. "Nirasawa, come with me. Keen, stay here. Let our prisoners have a moment to think about how they want this to end." Keen stepped up to take Nirasawa's place, holding Lara and Ellis. It was a setback as far as keeping the pressure on, but Briggs wanted to be here when the woman finally broke. After all the effort he'd put in, he didn't want to miss the moment of triumph. An alarm was sounding from somewhere lower on the station, an annoying bleat like some animal being stepped on repeatedly. It bled up into the night sky, making Briggs even more uncomfortable. What the hell is going on here? Vincent stepped out onto the platform, Briggs and Nirasawa right behind, and it occurred to him that perhaps he wasn't the only one on Bunda aware of the information on that log. Aware that there were billions to be made for anyone, any corporation, with access to hard stats on infestation. No, he'd been careful. The company had it all locked down. But there are enemies within. Someone like Julia Russ, maybe, or any one of a dozen competitors he could think of, desperate for that spot on the board. Wayland Yutani wanted results. They didn't necessarily care who handed them in. Briggs turned, leaning back into the stale shuttle air. "Watch for strangers," he said. Keen, towering over his two charges, Jess at his feet, nodded briskly. It would have to do. Briggs turned back to Vincent, motioning impatiently for him to lead the way, and deciding, quite firmly, that it was the monotonous scream of the station's alarm that was making him feel so anxious. When the ME shook, Tom Cabot was hiding out in the rec room, watching a sci-fi holovid in dark with a few of the researchers, Cindy and Di, both paleo women, and John C., one of the maintenance guys. The sudden up and down wasn't too bad where they were. All of them managed to keep their seats, but Cabot knew that parts of the station would have been harder hit. The second it stopped, all of them were on their feet, moving towards the open door that led out into the wrecked platform. The floor was slanted just a bit. Cabot could feel it, and when he heard the stabilizer alarm start up, he felt real fear. MEs weren't supposed to quake like that, and something had to be seriously wrong if the nav computers couldn't keep the alarm from sounding. Either someone entered a drift code, or we got caught on something big, something heavy. And it just had to happen with a suit on board, didn't it? First time ever, and Vincent will be having a shit fit. They reached the door, moving out onto the platform littered with bolted tables and chairs. Cabot stepping up to the railing. John C. and the two scientists joined him, identical expressions of nervous concern on their faces. The rec deck overlooked control directly. Maybe they'd be able to see something. "What's that?" Cindy said, pointing to the deck below. The outside lights were low. It was hard to tell. A sprawl of something wet, shining darkly. "Oh shit," Di said weakly. "It's windy. That's windy." They stared down at what was left of the channel watcher. No chance he was alive with all of that blood. And behind them, something shrieked. A gurgling, unbridled howl. A scream of murder about to happen. Cabot spun and saw nothing at all. But the horrible sound went on, erupting out of thin air. And then they were all stumbling away from the rail, running for the tunnel that opened out onto the deck that would take them away from the invisible screamer. And Cindy, closest to the corridor, let out a strangled cry and stopped cold, her head whipping back as if she'd run into something, her limbs flailing wildly. All of them pulled to a stop only a couple of meters behind her, clutching at each other like frightened children. "What is it? What's happening?" John C. screamed, and no one answered, watching in shocked terror as metal claws appeared in front of Cindy, from nowhere, a sharp sliding sound. And then they were swooping down from above, raking her open from throat to belly. Blood gushed out and hit the platform with a wet slap, and Cindy collapsed, crashing face first into the sudden lake of red. Cabot didn't waste time wondering. He grabbed at John C. and Di, giving them a jerk before spinning around and sprinting for the door back into the rec room. He didn't turn back to see if they were following. Didn't care. All he wanted was to get the fuck away from whatever had clawed Cindy open. Oh, please God, Buddha, Jesus, don't let me die. Behind him, an alien howl. A caterwaul of triumph. And he was going to make it. The door was right there. And the crazy hope that crashed through him as he burst into the dimly lit room was the last thing he felt. Except for the unseen arm that clamped down across his throat. Except for the slick, hot sensation of being drained as something cold slipped through his abdomen.